When I talk about like going to these other places, isn't it almost weird? Okay, for those who have never gone off on a mission trip, it probably seems weird to you to think that there are actually places on the earth where people are wanting to hear about Jesus. Doesn't that seem kind of weird? I mean, living in Southern California, where you bring up Jesus and it seems like people are so offended by it, or they just don't want to have anything to do with him. They don't want to hear it. Wouldn't it be weird to step onto a country where once you start talking about Jesus, people would flock to you and just want to know? It'd be a little easier, huh? And it's a weird thing, but sometimes I wonder if people in America, though, it's not that they're not attracted to Jesus, it's just that they're not attracted to what they see in churches today, in Christianity today. That seems like more what's going on, especially here in Southern California. I mean, it's not that they don't like Jesus, I just don't know that they've ever seen him, and that we're representing him properly. I really believe that if the believers, if the church, if we really were the people that God called us to be, having this passionate love relationship with God, not just a bunch of churchgoers, but people who are radically transformed in our lives, where this is everything to us, then it would become more attractive. See, it's very similar to what was going on in Jesus' day. It's amazing how times really don't change that much. People really don't change that much. See, back then, they had these people, we've talked about them many times, the Pharisees, and they were the religious leaders. They were the church people. They were the leaders in religion. You want to go through God, you go through the Pharisees. But what these people were these people in these nice long gowns, these robes, and very, very respectable, individuals who were followers of God. And yet what they did is they had this whole works-based, religion and enforced these rules on these people, and a lot of people were turned off by it all. And what happens is suddenly you have John the Baptist, he shows up, and then Jesus shows up, and suddenly, people start flocking to them. They start running to them. Why? Because they saw something real. And I really believe that if the world saw more of that in Christians, not just people who attend church and don't swear and don't drink, but people who are showing the real thing, a passionate, radical love for Jesus Christ, there really is something very attractive about that. I love what Tony said a few weeks ago when he was preaching here, and he talked about how, isn't it interesting how when Jesus was on the earth, that the prostitutes, the alcoholics, the worst of the worst type of sinners would come to Jesus, the murderers, the thieves, they'd all surround Jesus. They were attracted to him, and yet they can't stand us. And what is that? What is that? What was that about Jesus that was so attractive to these people? And what is it about us that so turns them off? In Luke chapter 16, Jesus is confronting these Pharisees because they weren't the real thing. And the truth is most churchgoers are not the real thing. Okay? At least here in America. I mean, so many people go to church, but how many people are genuinely, passionately in love with God in such a way to where their lifestyle and their faith is attractive to the world? Remember when we left off, before Easter, we talked about that parable of the shrewd manager. Remember that guy? That's kind of that weird story, but it was a great story, about this guy's realizing, I'm going to get fired, I better hurry up and do something, that whole thing. And at the end of that story, at the end of that parable, in verse 14, it says in Luke 16, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. Jesus confronts these Pharisees, who they hated the teaching of Jesus, because Jesus spoke against this love of money, and the Pharisees loved their money. They could hide it, they could justify it and make people in the world go, oh, okay, they don't really love it. But Jesus says, you know what, you can justify yourself before men, but God knows your hearts. That you're not into him. You're in this little religion that you've created, but you're not really into God. You're into your money. And then he goes on in verse 16, and he said, the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the good news of the kingdom of God is being preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. It is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. Okay, so what is Jesus talking about here? I mean, why suddenly this transition to the law? This is very important. Okay, the Pharisees back then, the religious leaders, picture these religious people in these nice gowns and, with all their religious symbols and bling bling, They're walking around and everyone's looking to them. Okay, we are the leaders. Anyone that wants to come to God, come through us. And they felt like they had a monopoly on salvation and God. And you got to come through us to get to God. Okay, and that's pretty much what they knew of religion, what they knew of God. In fact, these Pharisees, they had come up with their own, it really was like this works-based religion. Like you do this, you obey these laws that we have created, and they weren't things that God had written. They took the liberty of taking God's word and then adding to it and making these additional rules that people had to follow and saying, look, if you follow this, this, and this, and we'll check up on you, this is the way to heaven. And not only that, but this works-based religion taught that if you had the favor of God, you would become rich. And so what the Pharisees did is that they saw that those who were rich were blessed by God and those who were poor were not. And so it was it was a lot about favoritism. And the Pharisees ended up spending a lot of time with those who were rich. And not only that, but, they themselves were rich because that showed that they were blessed by God. All of this money, all of this wealth. And so what Jesus says is, he says, listen, the law and the prophets, the law is Moses, talking about Moses and the law that God gave through him. The law and the prophets being, all the prophets in the Old Testament, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, on and on. The law and the prophets, they were God's spokesmen. Those were the people that God used until the time of John the Baptist. Okay, so he says you got the law and the prophets, then you've got John. But you got these Pharisees in the middle, and Jesus doesn't mention them because they're not really in the loop. Okay? He's saying you had the law and the prophets, and then came John. You have this little hiccup called the Pharisees, in the middle, but they're not a part of God's plan here. They're not a part of his plan, but they weren't his messengers. Okay? It was the law and the prophets, and then came John. He kind of bypasses them, and he explains that ever since John the Baptist came, he goes, what's happened? Ever since John the Baptist came and the good news was being preached, he says everyone has been forcing his way into this kingdom. It's this picture of ever since John comes that there's like this mad rush now of that's what we want. We want this God. And it's kind of this pushing these Pharisees away because true religion had come, true faith had come. And you got to understand, it was so different too, because while you have these religious people in all their garb and so respectable and these nice, supposed followers of God, then suddenly comes this guy out of the desert. Remember how it describes John the Baptist? Just this gnarly looking guy wearing camel hair, eating locusts and honey, going, let me tell you about God, and suddenly it's like, whoa, everyone saw something real in this guy though. There was something genuine. There was this thing that was so attractive. And ever since he came, it's like everyone wanted that. Everyone was forcing their way into it. And Jesus was kind of proclaiming, look, this reign of the Pharisees is over. People have seen the real thing, and now they're forcing their way in. See, that's what happens when you've got the genuine article, the good news that Jesus has been preaching. He says, now, look, everyone, not just the rich people, not just the dignified, respectable people, everyone, he says, is forcing his way into it. And it was a very, very beautiful thing. I still believe that people long for this. Okay, this guy coming out of the desert, this guy that just, not like the Pharisees, he doesn't care about money. He doesn't care about money. He doesn't have this love for money. He's found this relationship with God to where money just doesn't even matter. It's a non-issue. That's attractive to people. When they see someone who really believes what he believes, really lives it out, so different. And And these people now are fighting, and I believe people want this. When people recognize, I've got a soul that needs to be saved. I've got an eternity that I've got to start preparing for. Once you realize that and accept that in your own heart, once you realize, I've got a soul that's eternal and it's going to go somewhere. And I'm realizing that now. And I've got this eternity, and what I do now on this earth is going to depend on what eternity is going to look like for me. I got to get serious about this. And people start forcing their way in. They're not waiting for the Pharisees to lead the way. And that's really the way we ought to be, is that you personally should have such a passion, such an understanding that, man, this life is short. It's going to be over any second. I got to get things right. I got to make sure I'm right before God. Forget Francis. Forget any of the church leaders. I just got to get there. And they may even get in my way. I just got to get to God. Man, because I could slow you down. God could be calling you to have a relationship with Him that goes way beyond anything I've ever experienced. Man, don't let me get in the way. Don't let people that are supposed to be your leaders get in the way. Man, this is something that is huge. And you should have a passion. You should be running after it with all your might. Just like the people back then were. They kind of pushed the religious leaders aside and said, man, I want more than what you got. I want far more than what you're giving me. Because we're talking about heaven here, and this is my passion. See, the world needs to see more people like this. Not just respectable churchgoers with their nice little homes and families and jobs and everything else, but people that are just crazy, just passionate, that everything is about God, and this stuff really doesn't matter. See, Jesus was sickened. He says, in that earlier verse, he says, what's highly valuable among men, highly valued among men, is detestable in God's sight. What would you say that this passage describes you? As a person that's just passionately just forcing your way into the kingdom? Or are you pretty reserved about your faith and kind of like the Pharisees and kind of like these churchgoers? Or, yeah, God's a part of my life. Yeah, I do the God thing. Or is this something where you just go, this is everything to me. This is eternity. I'll do anything for it. Because that's attractive when you see people who really live out what they believe. When he says in verse 17, it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. Okay, he's explaining that now that John the Baptist came and now that Jesus is here, he's saying, we're not negating the law. Okay, the law, the prophets, everything that God has said so far, He still means, we're upholding that. The gospel is not getting rid of the law and getting rid of those things. It's really a simplifying of it. Okay, He says, I'm not coming and abolishing everything that's ever happened in the past, saying, okay, that was all wrong. He says, no, really, I'm a fulfillment of that. And, when he says that it's easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for even the tiniest bit of God's law to drop out, why is that? You see, God's law, when He gives us those moral laws, those commands, those laws are a reflection of who He is. Those laws are a reflection of the character of God. Okay, this is what God believed and was all about. It's what His character was about when this world was created and beforehand. And this is what God will be like forever. You see, these words that He gives to us and these commands, man, they're a reflection of what He is, and that's not going to change. He says before that changes, heaven and earth would pass away, and it will. It's easier for heaven and earth. I mean, that's something He created in the middle there somewhere. He made this heaven, made this earth, and He's going to destroy this heaven and destroy this earth and make a new one. No big deal, but He Himself remains the same. And so these laws He gave that are a reflection of His character, His morality, hey, that's not going to change. And He's explaining this to the people. You see, because God doesn't change. Okay, what He valued 1,000,000 years ago, He values today. And He'll value 1,000,000 years from now. Because in order to change, you've got to go from worse to better. Or better to worse. But if you're perfect, you can't get any better. And if you're perfect, then you can't allow yourself to get worse. And so he remains the same. He's same yesterday, today, and forever. And so his law and the things that he values, that'll remain the same. And he's telling the Pharisees this. He goes, I'm not changing anything here. I'm just upholding. I'm just simplifying. I'm getting us back to the root, the core of what God was saying from the very start. See, when Jesus says you can sum up, he says you can sum up all the law and the prophets with these two commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He says that's at the core of everything God taught. And he gives an example of how the law doesn't change. He goes, for example, in the area of divorce. He says in verse 18, he says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. And the man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. He goes, for example, ever since the beginning, this issue of divorce had run rampant in their day, okay? Very similar to today. You know, the church no longer valued it. The believers, it just wasn't a big issue. People just felt like, well, I can come and go as I please. And, you know, as long as I feel like, you know, I was dealt a bad hand or bad wife or bad husband, I'm out of here. And and there was, you know, I'll just get a certificate of divorce and move on. And Jesus has explained to these Pharisees, listen, the law's still the same. God still hates divorce. It's still adultery. It's still one of those 10 commandments. And when you divorce, man, you're committing adultery. And I think that he points this issue out because if you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19, I think this is why he brings this issue up of divorce. Because he's talking about the whole law, and then he brings it to this one issue of divorce. But it's because that was what was going on during that day. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 3, you have these Pharisees, and it says that some Pharisees came to test him. And they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Okay, so the Pharisees are asking Jesus, can't we divorce our wife for this reason, or this reason, or this reason, or really any reason that we really feel in our heart? And what Jesus answers in verse 4 says, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female. And he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but they are one. And therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate. Then verse 7, why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay, so they're saying, hey, Jesus, can't we divorce our wives for any reason? And Jesus says, no way. Are you kidding me? You know, God joins them together. When you become married, you become one. In God's eyes, you are one flesh. You don't tear your body in half. You don't tear it apart. God put it together, and don't you, as a mere human being, dare tear apart what He's put together. And the people go, oh, but wait a second. What about in the time of Moses? Moses told those guys to give their wives a certificate of divorce. And that's Moses. And Jesus says, yeah, but the point was not that he was allowing divorce or permitting divorce. See, what was going on? He says he permits that because your hearts were hard. Okay, what's he saying? In that day, what was going on is that people knew what God's law was. They knew they should not divorce, but their hearts got hardened, which can happen so often in marriage where you just go, you know what? I don't care. I'm not going to be married to this person anymore. You know, and people would just leave and send their wives away. They would kick them out, saying, you know what, I don't care what God's law, you're out. And what happens is when that woman would leave and she's kicked out of her own home, you know, she's being divorced by her husband, suddenly she has no rights anymore. She can't remarry because she's married. She has no way to make a living. I mean, she just has lost everything. And so what Moses does, because these men were committing these acts of adultery and sending their wives away and just grabbing someone else, you know, was a protection of these women and saying, hey, you know what? If you're going to do that, then give her a certificate of divorce. And a certificate of divorce frees her, gives her the right to go and remarry after what you did to her. Because that's why Moses allowed that. That's why Moses, was giving this certificate of divorce. It was not because God was suddenly saying, oh, I don't care about marriage anymore. But it's because you were so hardened that even though God's law told you not to do that, you still did it, and it was a protection of these people. That's what that certificate of divorce was all about. And so what the Pharisees did with that and what was going on in that day, they're like, yeah, Moses later on said, hey, divorce is okay. And Jesus says, no way. It's never been this way. This is not the way it was from the beginning. From the beginning, God had this intention. This is the way he made it. Okay, and it still remains to this day. And it doesn't matter how long you guys exist on this earth, 2,000 years later, it's still God's values. Heaven and earth are going to pass away before God starts saying, I don't care about marriage. This has always been his heart. You understand, marriage is sacred to God. It always has been and it always will be. It is a sacred, sacred thing. First, because you're making a vow. You are making a vow before a holy God. And Ecclesiastes 5 goes, don't you dare make a vow before God and not keep it. Okay, just keep your mouth shut and don't ever make that vow. But to make a vow before God and then break it, you're crazy. You don't do that. But not only that, but you got to understand, marriage has been a picture. God has used marriage all throughout history. He has used marriage as a picture of his love for us, his love for his followers. This isn't just a New Testament thing. I mean, you go back to the Old Testament, and God used marriage for the sake of Israel. Okay, this is another reason why this is so sacred to God. Because, like in the book of Hosea, you guys know the story of Hosea in the Old Testament. You've got this prophet, and God tells Hosea, and God can tell us to do whatever he wants, okay? Realize when you're God, that's one of your privileges. He tells Hosea, because Hosea was a prophet, he says, God, I give you my life. You speak to the people through me. And God tells Hosea, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to marry this girl named Gomer. Okay, so you go marry her. And you think, wow, that is mean. To make him marry a girl named Gomer? And, but that's not even half of it. The worst thing is that Gomer is a prostitute. Okay, so God tells Hosea, I want you to marry Gomer the prostitute. Okay? And you picture Gomer going, well, golly. Just the whole... some of you are too young for that, but the whole that whole idea of wow, so he has to marry this prostitute. Why? Because what happens is he marries her and she becomes unfaithful to him. That's what prostitutes do. She's off with someone else. She's with another man. She leaves. And then in Hosea chapter 3, verse 1, God's talking to Hosea, and it says, the Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. What is God telling Hosea? He says, you know what I want you to do? I know your wife's been unfaithful. I know she's with someone else right now, but I want you to go after her. Okay, Hosea, you go after her and you love her and you win her back. Why? Because that's what I'm doing with the Israelites. Here are these people who have gone off and they've worshipped other gods, but I still love them. And so I'm going to go after them. And I want your marriage to be a picture of that. You show the world, you show the Israelites that even though they've been unfaithful and they've been terrible wives to me, these people have been so unfaithful, they've sinned against me, do all these things that I hate, but I'm still going after them. And that's why I want you to still go after Gomer. Because I want the world to see that that's the way God loves us. See, that was a picture. It's bigger. It was bigger than Hosea and his little life on the earth and his little relationship with this woman. God says, I've got a bigger plan throughout history. I want people to know how much I love them. And that's going to be reflected by your marriage. Your marriage is going to be a picture of that for all times. And that's why marriage is sacred, because it's how we show the world the love of God. You turn over to a few other, the last prophet Malachi. And Malachi talks about marriage. In Malachi chapter 2, the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 2, in verse 13, he says, "Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer pays attention to your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. You ask why? It is because the Lord is acting as the witness between you and the wife of your youth, because you have broken faith with her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. Has not the Lord made them one? In flesh and spirit they are his." And why one? Because he was seeking godly offspring. So guard yourself in your spirit and do not break faith with the wife of your youth. I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel. You see, these people in Malachi's day, they're weeping. They're going, "Oh, God's not listening to our prayers anymore." And Malachi says, you know why he's not listening to your prayers? It's because of what you did with your wife. It's because you divorced her, and God hates that. He hates the fact that you would leave that person that God joined you together in one flesh and become unfaithful and go somewhere else. God hates that. So don't go crying to him. Okay, he's not listening to your prayers because of the way you treated your wife. And it's the same thing is spoken in the New Testament. How our prayers can be hindered by the way that we treat our wives. And he says that you respect and you honor your wife as a fellow heir of the grace of life. Otherwise, your prayers are going to be hindered. Same thing. God's values don't change. You can't say, "Well, I've got this great relationship with God. I just got a horrible relationship at home with my spouse. I love God. I just hate her or I hate him." It doesn't work that way. God says, you know what? It's a package thing. You work out your marriages because that's the way you show the world how much I love the world. When we go to Ephesians 5, in the New Testament, we've already talked from Luke, from Matthew, but then in the epistles in Ephesians 5, we look at that and we go, well, Ephesians 5, that's the chapter on marriage. Yes, but no. Is it really about marriage? Yes and no. Is that really the main point? Is that we could have a happy marriage? Is Ephesians 5 the passage that teaches us how to have a happy marriage? Kind of. But there's something much bigger to it. See, in Ephesians 5, when he says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, verse 22. And in verse 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And goes on, and we've studied this several times, and we'll get into it again because it's such an important issue. But after all of that, in verse 31, he says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery." Then look what he says. "But I'm talking about Christ and the church." He says, this is an amazing thing, this husband and wife coming together and them becoming one. He goes, it's such a mystery. He goes, but I'm actually talking about Christ and the church here. The real mystery is how the church, we can become one with God. See, that's the core issue. And that's the picture that is painted through our marriage. The goal is that the world would see God's love for the church. See, so through my marriage, people should be able to see God's love. That as a husband, I'm supposed to be a picture of Christ to the church, and my wife then becomes the church. And no matter what she does, no matter how unfaithful or whatever she does, I'm going to keep pursuing and loving her so that the world will see, wow, no one ever does that. And I can say, yeah, they do. That's what Christ does for you. That we're supposed to have that type of love. And then, it says that it's a wife's responsibility to come under the leadership of her husband. Why? To show the role of the church to God. And people go, well, no one does that. Yeah, well, that's what the church is supposed to do. Sometimes I wonder if, the way the church treats God is because of the way wives treat their husbands in marriage. In the church, we kind of weed through God's word and say, well, I don't like that verse. Let's throw that out. I don't like that one either. Let's just ignore that one. This whole book right here, let's just take that one out. And we kind of revamp it based upon what we desire. Why? Because we're not really submitting ourselves to God. We're not humble enough to do that. We submit when we like it. When it fits with us and what we feel like doing. And the same way, that's what we do in marriage. It's like, oh yeah, I respect my husband here, but you know what, I'm not following him here. Why? Because I disagree. And we paint this picture of, oh yeah, that's the same thing we do with God. But that wasn't the intention from the beginning. See, it's this humility that we've got to have in marriage to say, you know what? My job is not to say, well, my wife's being unfair to me, I'm out of here. My job is to show the world, no, I'm going to love her, I'm going to sacrifice for her, I'm going to give her, I'll die for her. Why? Because that's what Christ did for me. For a wife to say, you know what, I'm going to respect my husband, I'm going to follow him, and I'm going to respect him and support him and encourage him. Why? Because that's what I do with God. And that's bigger than you. You got to understand, this is not all about you. Hosea's life was not all about Hosea, nor Malachi's or anyone else's. It's about God. If you're a believer, you understand that everything in your life is about Him. You see, here's God, okay? I don't have roly-polies. Don't get excited. You guys are going, oh, cool, he brought him back. Okay, no, it's just an overhead. Okay, here's you remember from math, a timeline. And what does this mean? It goes on forever in both directions, right? It's eternal. Okay, this is God. God called the I Am. He's eternal. He's always, his law, what he believes, his character, what he values, it's the same. That line, that black line would just go across this room. It would just go on forever and ever. Picture that line. In this direction and in that direction. There's this God who's just always been. He's always been the same. He's always valued the same things. And in there, he creates the world. And then, here's you. Okay, you came into existence at some point, and you go, oh, and then you start growing, you're living, and you go, okay, now I'm 50 years old, okay, and here you are, some here in God's economy of things, there you are, and what you do is you go, God, I think I got some suggestions for you. I don't think, this marriage thing should be forever. And I think we should be able to divorce for a lot of different reasons. And I think now that homosexuality should be accepted and it should be okay. And I think we should have sex before marriage. And I think this is okay and that's okay. Great. Thanks for the suggestion. Okay, but who do you think you are? I mean, really? Who are you to come now suddenly thousands of years after the world's created and say, no, I've got a better idea. Let's change God's law a little bit. And the whole world starts listening and following. You see, I understand right now it's not popular for me to preach what I'm preaching today. It's just not. But you know what? I don't care. I don't care because there's this God who has been here forever, longer than anyone that's been here on this earth. This little speck on the earth is saying, oh, you're being judgmental, you're being this. I don't care because in the end, I'm going to be with this eternal God forever. And so whatever He says and whatever He says He values, I'm going to value. And this is the way it's always been in the past. It's always going to be this way. The earth and the heavens are going to be here. They're going to disappear. And guess what? God's law remains. It's not going to die because it's a reflection of who He is. And so this is why we do what we do. This is why we stand on what we stand for. And yeah, the majority of the world, they're going to think differently. But that's okay because you know what? They're just going to be here for this long in God's economy of things. And we've got an eternal God, the great I Am, and we follow Him and we do what He says we do. We submit to Him because who in the world are we? And the amazing thing is that when we really submit ourselves to His law and His way of morality, it's incredible how much joy we find, how much peace we have, and how we just know this is right, this is it, God's way. Man, there's a reason why He gives us these laws. See, this issue of marriage, man, we're just losing it. We're losing the battle. Do you know there are more divorces within the church than there are outside now? That's how sick it's become. This is just like the Pharisees' day. Well, can I divorce for this, that? No. Okay? God says no. He's always said no. Unless there's been marital unfaithfulness. If your spouse has cheated on you or this or that, and if they leave you and you have no control over that. But other than that, no, you can't. Why? Because, hey, if you're struggling right now and you say, well, it's all my wife. She's horrible. She's miserable. She's terrible. God made that law before He created her. we can play those types of games, and the point is the issue is it's just like what God says to Hosea. He says, look, no. Why? Because why are you in that marriage? Because God wants you to show the love of Christ to the world. He wants you to show the love of Christ to the world. Where God says, no, these people have been unfaithful, but I love them so much that I'll send my own son. I'll suffer myself on that cross so that these people can be forgiven. And he's saying that's what he wants you to do, husbands. That's what he wants you to do, wives. To love, to build these things up. It's not enough just for you to be married and to stay married, okay? That's not all God's asking for. He doesn't tell Hosea, hey, just keep that marriage conflict, that contract and don't get divorced. He says, no, you go back and you love her. Why? Because we're supposed to be a light. Do you have a marriage that's a light, that's attractive? Do people see you as a couple that has common values, that has a goal that you're heading toward, and it's something that they envy? Or do they just see you as, oh, those are a respectable church-going couple and their nice little family? Or are you like the John the Baptist, that's just, man, God's everything to us, and we as a family, we strive together for it. We're going after it. And I know it's hard. Every person's got their issues, so every marriage does as well. That last week when I was talking about the shrewd manager, and you talk about how his job's almost over and how life is so short and we got to hurry up, because compared to eternity, we got to just get this stuff done and then we're set for all of eternity. The problem with that is sometimes life doesn't feel short, does it? It seems like, man, this just goes on. And this is a marathon. And that's exactly what the Bible describes it also. It talks about perseverance all the time. I mean, sometimes I look at how long I've been in the ministry, these last 12 years or so, and I think, man, I could have another 40 years in ministry. So, there's days where you go, man, I'm running this marathon, I'm at mile 6, and I'm ready to drop out, and yet God says, no, you can run and not grow weary. I'll let you walk, and you won't faint. You'll rise up with wings like eagles. And I know in marriage, that's exactly what it feels like sometimes, where you just go, the rest of my life, yeah. But God can do incredible things during that time. And I've seen some miracles take place. Absolutely incredible things in marriages where you would have just said, there's no way. But when you both submit and humble yourselves before God, you'd be amazed what he can do and what he can make out of it and what a light that would be to the world. But this is why we're losing it. We think people aren't attracted to Jesus. No, they're just not attracted to us. This may be a day. I know this is such a heavy issue, and in a group this size, I know there's a ton of you that are struggling with your marriages. And man, I just want you to know that it's bigger than you. It's bigger than your kids. And I'm not just saying, hey, hold on to your marriage because of your kids. And I'm saying, hold on to your marriage because the eternal God is using you as a picture to show the world of who he is. He's a God that doesn't just divorce us and walk away from us. He's a God that no matter how bad we get, he has still loved us and pursued us to the point where he even sent his son to die for us. And that's what we're on the earth to do, is to tell people what a beautiful, wonderful God we have. And we do that not just with our words, but with our marriages. And those of you who are contemplating marriage, those of you who are younger and thinking about it, I'm so glad you heard this before you got into it. Because you need to know this is for life. Whoever you're going to be with, this is for life. And this is not some, romantic, beautiful, fairy tale thing that you just jump into. No, sometimes it's a grind it out, you figure it out, and you love this person at their worst. That's what marriage is. And that's the way it always will be in God's eyes. And just know that before you get into it. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing that God has created, but the church is tearing it apart and destroying what God's put together, and it's wrong. We got to put an end to it.